We'll be talking about economic inclusion, and part of the reason for this topic is because the tight labor market has continued to get even tighter and made it necessary to have a more inclusive policy in terms of bringing people into the labor force. So I'll talk about that first, show you the tight labor market, and then we'll talk a little bit about some data and how you can portray your region to show expanding firms that they can still grow in your region because of the pipeline of workers that you have. And then finally, I'll end with creating strategies to link high schools to jobs of the future. And I'll give you an example of what Richmond, Virginia is doing with some academies through the Ford Foundation, Next Generation, who they are working with. So first, the national economy. In terms of an overview, as I said earlier today, we are 1 month off the longest expansion we've ever seen in this country. So it's very likely that we're going to see that. And as we look at the economy, it appears that we're going to see growth through at least 2019, especially with some of the trade tariff issues resolved with Mexico, and possibly even all through 2020. So the labor markets are near what we call full employment, very low, and we've started to see wages increasing. So first, the broad indicator of economic activity, GDP, you can see the big decline that we saw in the past, the Great Recession, and we're seeing some continued growth. 3.1% is really considered faster than potential, so it's a pretty good growth rate. And here in terms of employment, again, starting with the nation, we see that we continue to see the labor market improve. We're way beyond levels that we had seen during the prior recession. The unemployment rate continues below the 4% level and has been there for the past few months. But that doesn't really tell the whole story about unemployment. We economists have several different unemployment figures that we look at. The 3.6% is what's called the U3 unemployment rate, and that's the one you see in the newspaper all the time. But there's something called the U6 unemployment rate, which is 7.1%. So it's nearly double what the publicly used one is. And here, 7.1% represents the percentage of people who are working part-time and would rather full-time jobs, or they're marginally attached, meaning they haven't looked for a job in the past 4 months, but if you were to offer them one, they would accept it. So again, these people, 7.1% in terms of marginally attached as well as part-time versus full-time. So when we look at that over time, I mean, that seems like a lot more than the natural unemployment rate. When we look at it over time, it's the blue line, and you could see that the U6 got all the way up to almost 18% right after the Great Recession. 18% of people were working part-time, would rather full-time, or they were marginally attached to the workforce. But it's now down at levels which you would consider normal. And so we economists are always debating things, and the question is, why is the participation rate low? Why are there not more people in the economy? If it's because people are retiring, then that makes sense. If there's some other underlying structural issue, then that might need some policy around it. So the black line here is the participation rate of everyone working that's 16 and over in the workforce. So it's about, on that side, 63%. And it's been that way since about 2015. And the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas did a really interesting report a couple of months ago, and they pulled out the prime age participation rate. So what is the participation rate of people aged 25 through 54? And notice it's increased from about 80 to 82%. And in their analysis, they concluded that the few months of this year when we had 170, 180,000 jobs created a month, had we not been drawing in this prime age workforce, the growth rate of employment would have been more around 10 to 20 to 30,000. So the point of that is that if we're going to draw more people into the workforce, we need to start pulling in those people that have dropped out of the workforce and maybe some of the other populations that have dropped out quite some time ago. And I'll end with that. And then Ben will talk more about what they're doing at DCCD to bring in those populations. So here again, going back to 2002, I've broken out those cohorts. So here's the percentage of people 55 and plus who are in the labor force. And notice we 55 and plusers are supposed to be retiring. Some of the decline is due in participation rate is due to this age group retiring. But notice that rather than it coming down, it's held steady. And during the recession, it actually went up, probably because people lost money in the stock market and had to work longer. But it's not clear here whether that's trend is due to we baby boomers love our work and we're just working longer, or maybe we didn't save enough, and so we're having to work longer. But in any case, the more disconcerting one is the 16 through 24 age group. And notice during the recession that that participation rate fell, and that's typical when they can't find a job and they've just graduated. They go back and hope that by getting more education they'll be able to get a job in the future. But check this out. Since 2002, that participation rate has been falling. It has stabilized, but what other surveys show is they're staying in school longer, what's driving that trend. But the 25 to 54 prime working age group, there at the top, is the group that has been starting to move up in terms of their participation. So wage growth has finally started to pick up, and you could see it's up about 3% from a year ago, although it was up almost 3.5%. It's now back to 3% as of the May 2019 data. So the labor market in the U.S. and Texas and everywhere is really tight. Next, what we're going to look at is retention, how to show, or even bringing firms into the region, how can we show that we've got the talent pipeline? So here I chose Garland, Texas, the county, just because of where we are. And you can drill down and look at data at the zip code level. So here I'm going down to the zip code level. The zip codes are at the top, and the number of production workers are below them. So I'm thinking about, I had the example today about a chemical paint coatings manufacturing firm expanding. So let's stick with that idea, and let's just pick this 75041 zip code. Let's say we're going to expand somewhere between Centerville and White Rock in terms of our plant. So will we find the workers that we need in that particular zip code? And in part, I picked it because there are a lot of production workers there, so it seems like it might be a good choice. So now I went ahead and put in that 75041 zip code and created a 30-mile radius around it to look at where my production workers are going to be. So notice in the darker areas that we have in Plano, Texas, for example, we have a number of production workers that we may be able to draw. In Irving, some production workers, and over here we have production workers. So you can see by driving 30 minutes, and this is the average drive time, although we could put in drive time during rush hour or during evening hours, we're using the average drive time in this case. And then we need to look at, okay, what occupations are within that 30-minute drive time zip code, and do we have enough of those occupations? So here first, we're going to need 57 mixing machine setters, and here are how many we have in the region. And then here we have that candidate to opening ratio, and remember we want 50 people employed or unemployed for every one you're going to hire. So if this is red, you don't have enough. So the next thing you can do is take a look at what are the occupations that could be trained to move into that particular occupation where you don't have enough workers to show your expanding firm, or the expanding firm that's either currently in the region or coming in from outside the region, that they'll find the workforce that they need within this 30-minute drive time. So here I'm just showing you the mixing blending machine setters and where they're located by zip code. And you can see there were 43 in the zip code that I did choose, 119 right next to it, 37, a lot of different areas. And as you go out further along the interstate, you can see some pockets where you can start to draw those workers. And so here, the other thing that we could look at is, or are the workers that have alternative occupations that can be trained. And in this case, you can see we have 2,361 within that 30-minute drive time that can be trained to move up to that mixing blending machine setter. Typically, they're making less money, so they have a motivation to want to get trained to make more money. And here, in terms of the pipeline of graduates, for chemists, for example, we can identify the universities that train people to become chemists and the number of four-year degrees and postgraduate degrees. If there were two-year degrees, they'd be there as well. So now, having looked at just the data that we have out there on occupations, another thing to consider is pockets of underserved. So one of the underserved could be those with disabilities, ages 18 to 64. And we can also look at the percentage of those with disabilities that are actually in the labor force. And oftentimes there are issues such as travel, transportation. If we're able to have better transportation, we can get more people with disabilities into jobs in the area. They may need more help in terms of identifying which jobs are available for them. But clearly, this is an area of serving those who are underserved that you could be looking at to help out your current firms and expanding firms. Another one is to look at poverty. And here we're looking at the poverty levels, with the blue being more people in poverty in this region within the 30-minute drive time. Another underserved segment that could be helped in terms of getting into the workforce. And then switching now, before I hand this over to Ben, to an example in Richmond that the Ford Foundation, I think it's called Next Generation Ford Foundation, is working on, is identifying themed academies. So Richmond is kind of condensed as opposed to Dallas. That's the geography or the mileage is far. And so they've got 8 different schools that they're trying to identify an academy or a theme for each of them based on what's in demand in the regions. And it's within a close enough distance that they could get kids to travel to those different areas. So here, looking at clusters, information technology, health, business management, STEM, finance. Richmond's a big finance center, all came up as possible academies. And so we also looked at, the governor has certain growth initiatives, and the Richmond region has certain growth initiatives, so we wanted to align those with the initiatives that are already in the area. And they also wanted to, as everyone else does, lift wages. So we have here those that are in above average growth clusters. And so what we identified then were advanced manufacturing, energy, a lot of utilities in the region, healthcare, information technology, professional business services, finance, insurance, logistics, and overlaying that is corporate headquarters. And these are all areas that these themed academies are each going to pick 1 or 2 of them. And as they bring in the high school students, then they'll be prepared to either go to college and get more education and skills, or go straight into the workforce in some of these areas. So one more thing before I hand this over to Ben is, how many of you get the Economic Development Quarterly? It's a monthly publication that comes out for the Journal of American Economic Revitalization. Interesting articles. And this past month, May's issue is a special issue on earnings and career advancements, possibilities for low-wage workers. So I was reading it on the way down here, and it's kind of discouraging. But so one of the studies was Gabe, Abel, and Florida, as in Richard, Florida, written on, can workers in low-end occupations climb the job ladder? And they used data from since the Great Recession, 2011 to 2017, and they looked over the short term on labor market transitioning. So that was a 1-year period. And so I'm questioning these results because it was a 1-year period. I think 1 year is too short to see a transition. So I'm taking this with a grain of salt, but it's discouraging nonetheless. They said just slightly more than 5% of workers in low-end occupations moved into higher quality occupations. Instead, around 70% of the workers in low-end occupations stayed in the same occupation. 11% exited the labor force, and 7% became unemployed, and 6% switched to a different low-end occupation. So that was a little bit discouraging, but again, it was a 1-year period that they were looking at over a 17 or 1-year increments over a longer period. But there were some other articles that pointed to some policy changes and to some progress in terms of career pathways for individuals out of low income into higher income areas. And I'm hoping that Ben will give us some more optimistic case studies.